the fact. So it is hitting the wall, but it is maybe not yet the fact. But I wanted to stimulate the reflections about discussions we have had in the years 2000, 2010. Since 10 years, I didn't study much the car manufacturing industry, but started again to do it since 1 year. So the first point is something, if the first point is something I will be very fast because I know you all are specialists, and so I won't learn you much. But there is still one element that I think is important to understand. The emergence of lean production started by the Toyota production system is the historical context of Japan. First, the labor relations just after the war, second, and third, the intelligence of two excellent engineers, Taishi Ono and Shigeo Shingo, that did find the practical and practical answers to those problems. So Toyota was not a car manufacturing company. They were manufacturing trucks for the army, essentially. And after the war, they changed their production lines for manufacturing cars for a small market with a lot of workers' resistance and also unions with an important communist influence. And so the response of the management was quite evident, mainly divide the union and co-opt the intelligence of the workers into the organization of work. So it started not by design, but it was a product by conditions. So my second slide goes into more into detail why the Toyota production system showed its effectiveness and became a model, which it hasn't the purpose in the beginning. I think it's also important to say and to recall the fact that the Japanese economic system and miracle is partially the product of monetary politics, cheap monetary currency, which made it more evident and more simple to sell the cars around the world, not yet in Europe, but in Asia and other parts. And at the same time, let's say the emergence of the Toyota productive system happened at the same moment as the crisis of the Fordist system in United States and Europe. Mainly, firstly in United States, let's say from the early 60s, saturated markets, because consumption society had already a telly and a car, but also a crisis in labor relations with a lot of wildcat strikes, disruptive social context in almost every factory. And the answer of the United States, the answer of the big three was first to merge, secondly to put pressure on the government and obtain via Bretton Woods this connection between dollar and gold value, so to be able to sell much more cars abroad, because they couldn't sell more anymore on an internal basis. At the same time, we had the German brands and also the Swedish. They were catching up and producing good quality that was matching much better the European market than the American big cars. Also, with the oil crisis, smaller car consumes less fuel. In the 70s, we had Volkswagen that was catching up and merging and enhancing its brand through yes, taking over Audi and later on Porsche, but that it's 20 years later. But still, they became a group, a little bit like General Motors, merging brands and commonalizing elements of composition of the cars. British manufacturers, they were pressured out of competition, out content. They couldn't sell abroad, and internally they had the internal competition of Ford, Vauxhall, Opel, selling cheaper cars. So then we go to the Japanese invincibility. There is an error there in the title. So in the beginning of the 80s, we have Japanese car manufacturers that are more and more visible in winning market share. And we have at the end of the 80s, I think at the end of the 80s, that book of the MIT, the machine that changed the world. I think it's from 86 or 88 or something like that. But it's in the 80s. And for me, that is the moment lean production was born. Like understanding that frugal production, frugal is a French word, but it's saying less is more. Obtaining a strong involvement of the workforce. In Japan, it was based upon the differences between skilled workers and home workers, women, workers in subcontracting factories. They didn't have much unemployment, but at least in Toyota, Nissan, and others, they guaranteed work for life. So what means that you can buy a house, for example. In Europe, from the late 80s and the 90s, I think the strong involvement was more based upon the fear of unemployment. The French car manufacturers were a little bit different, a little bit much more different, which is probably the explanation why colleagues like Michel Fresnay, Jean-Pierre Durand, Robert Boyer, and others, they said, well, it's not true. It's not the machine that changed the world. There is no new one best way. You have different types of strategies of profit, of market policies, of productive models. It's not only lean with team, Kanban, Kaizen, subcontracting, variable wages, and so on. So we had a debate that was not a real debate because it never started and so it never ended. But the point that is interesting is that at the same moment, you could have had that debate in Europe. There's a colleague like Koichi Shimizu, and he has written articles and also a book that was translated into French, where he was explaining why the Japanese model, lean production was in fact in crisis in Japan. Increasing wages, being more flexible regarding labor relations and better working conditions, also because they suffered a lot from karoshi, suicide at work, and so on. And at the same time, lean was becoming a problem of was not so efficient anymore in Japan. It became universal, more or less, because like Taylorism, you have Taylorism everywhere. I discovered not so long ago a pupil of Taylor, Henry Gantt, and he theorized how to organize clerical work on a Taylorist basis. And of course, it's not the same as time clocking and so on, but there are similarities. So when I'm saying that lean became universal, I'm not saying it's the same everywhere. I'm just saying some of the principles are used and mobilized everywhere. So I was one with some British colleagues to say there is a dynamic of universalization of lean, of the Toyotist production system, with differences depending the balance of forces, depending the products, depending the markets, depending the countries, but there is a dynamic that is a dynamic of convergence. And now I come to the four last picture, the beginning of the end. For me, the beginning of the end started in the years late 2000, early, yes, just before the financial crisis, with global value chains, cascading subcontracting, but Toyota using quality control to control first, second, third suppliers, because it was not working that well. We have had some scandals in the years 2000 of 200,000 or 300,000 cars that had to be taken off the market because of security problems. So one error means the same error for 300,000 cars. So that's also a symptom for me. At the same time, you have new brands, new actors coming up. You have in the years 2000 also a rampant crisis in labor relations, which started with the fact that a lot of factories, they had an elder workforce and had or to shut down or to lay off, because the elder workforce, let's say average was 45, 48, they couldn't stand anymore the intensivity of the work. But at the same time, if you have that crisis in the car manufacturing sector, lean was still becoming more and more universal. New public management, the hospital sector, logistics, and so on. So let's say the principles of lean were still expanding. And so why is my point, my central, my final point is the following. Why we are now facing an existential crisis of lean. First of all, because we have a disorganization of the supply chains on a global level, missing parts and missing suppliers. If you read MIT literature or others, you understand that in fact those that have access to market, so those that are holding the brands and have access to market, they don't know how much suppliers they have, and they don't know where it comes from. That's the first example. Second example is more recent, is the fact that you have a global shortage of semiconductors, microchips. We know that on worldwide scale, 60% is manufactured in Taiwan, which is also a geopolitical element. They started to talk about friendshoring. They want to set up a factory of microchips in near Dresden. In well, I forgot the name of the city. But what we have to understand, what we have to know, is that setting up a factory from zero that is assembling cars, it costs about $1 milliard, 1 billion. If you want to set up a factory of microchips, it costs you 80 billion. So it mobilizes much more capital, much less labor, but it uses a lot of electricity. It also uses a lot of water, and water that must be very clean, otherwise it doesn't work. You have several processes to manufacture microchips, and you can have very tiny microchips of 14 nanometer, but now you have microchips of 2. For robots, for automation robots, you can use the large ones, but for the phones, for the cars, it's not the case. So there is a real problem on that level of let's say, shortages. Then you have the other obstacle, which is ecological, which is the electrification of the car market, which is a regional issue. It's not the case in Latin America. It's not the case in Africa, of which the market is for 60 or 70% a second-hand market. It's less the case in Southeast Asia. I don't think it's much the case in Central Europe, but electrification, as Tommaso has written very sharply and very truly, if you want to achieve goals of sustainability in the next 10 years, you have to change completely the market, and you have to change completely the product. So also the assembly plants, also the product with all the compositions. When you have a battery of 500 kilogram, you need other suspension, chassis. You need elements that are completely different. It's not the same product anymore. So if you want only to sell not too expensive small cars with an autonomy of 200 or 300 kilometers, which is not the case, which is not the standard of the German ones. Well, you have a model like Zoe, like the Zoe model, it still costs 30,000 euro. In France, they are paying people to buy it. They're subsidizing it. It's not the case somewhere else. So there is, let's say, a problem of supply and disorganization of supply chain. There is a problem of components like microchip. There is a problem of sustainability of power, electricity. And the last and maybe the most important problem is the fact that the work conditions, the health, safety, the intensity of work, and so on, is that high that your labor market is very, very tiny, and you have a turnover of 3 years. You can sustain that kind of work for 3 or 4 years, not more. Afterwards, even when you're 30 years old, you have a problem of tendinitis, you have a problem of of your back and so on. So there is also a problem regarding the labor relations, even if the trade unions don't understand that very well. That's it. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan. That was actually very competent and will give us time to debate. Perhaps I just wanted, I expected that you would talk a little bit about your kind of field work, and you told me that you were in factories in Italy, that you follow up a little bit about that. So if you could give us, or if you are planning to do, how do you connect this theoretical vision with the reality that you see on the floor? That would be my first question, because you mentioned that your first book was not very much ethnographic, but now you're doing more kind of you're more in the fit. So can you give us some details about how do you plan to integrate your fieldwork in this perspective, and how does your fieldwork fits these analysis? Do you see the wall in the factories, or the wall is still farther up, or is already there?
Okay, I shall answer shortly and immediately. So I did some field work at Ferrari and Maserati in Modena, and now I'm starting to do the same. We'll do it in January at Melfi and Pomigliano. And what I see is that at least Ferrari and Maserati, they're big factories. Those are the factories that are producing, I don't know, 70 or 80% of all the production of that brands. They are earning well. So they are still male breadwinners, which is in Italy not often the case anymore. They have a strong identification to the brand. They have some power and some capacities to exert workers' control upon the assembly line, also because it's a small scale production. Ferrari and Modena, they are 5,000, but they are not producing 300,000 cars. They're producing 60,000, 70,000 at most. When they are supplied with microchips. So Stellantis is a different, let's say Fiat is a different situation. And the main point I can stress now is the fact that regarding labor relations, regarding collective agreements, they already obtained the opt-out of it. So collective agreements that are traditionally in Italy based upon a sector, upon a branch, per la Fiat non è il caso. They opted out, and the unions accepted it. And so now you have a growing disagreement, disturbance, opposition of non-unionized or unionized but syncobas and so on, against the fact that you have, in fact, like in the United States in the 80s, business unionism. And so these are the first elements I can share with you.
I have many other questions, but I open the floor to the other participants if they have a first round of questions for Stefan. In particular, if you share or you do not share these analysis about lean eating the wall, I think that is the debate. Is there a wall? Is lean capable of keep going, or is the lean machine breaking down?
I have a question, if it's possible.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay. So I like your conclusion when you say that, in fact, there are many obstacles for lean to continue. You're talking about environmental, ecological, social. I could have add about technological issues. But my point, in fact, is what is the issue? What is the problem? Is it a problem of lean manufacturing, or is it just a problem of the automotive industry, which is facing a very difficult context? This is the first time automakers have lost control. Regulation are forcing them to move toward electrification. This is not their own will to do so. There is many change in terms of new mobilities, new usage of the car. So my question is, where is the problem? Lean or the situation of the automotive industry?
I think the problem is first endogenic, internal, because the exhaustion of the labor force is a real problem, because the subcontracting organization is a real problem also, because you have a lack of components or lack of confidence towards the components. So you have an internal problem for sure, but that could be solved. I think it can be solved. It can be solved. But the second problem is the market and, let's say, globalization. If you, for example, I can share with you some articles about the shipping industry. I'm from Antwerp. I'm also part-time consultant to the shipping industry business in Antwerp. What I can hear from my colleagues, friends with whom I was to school, is that it's an amazing disorganization. There is only one container arriving at time, only one on two. Only 50% of the containers are arriving at schedule, which means that you don't know where you have to store them. At the same time, you need much more drivers, because those containers, they arrive full and they have to leave empty. They come from Asia, from China, and they arrive full of goods, but they have to be shipped back to China, but empty. So that's also something that is increasing the price. So you can say that it's not the car manufacturing sector is a symptom, but the real problem is global value chains being disorganized and lean production philosophy with no stocks, with automatization and real flow information that organize everything. It can't solve the problem, which for me is a problem of planification and of avoiding to go beyond the limits of the market. In resume, my answer.
Okay, thank you.
Can I make a comment here?
Yes, Thomas, please go ahead.
Many of the things that you said are quite interesting. Also, largely oriented to the European market. Some of my comments will be more oriented to the U.S. market. But in my view, there are three things that are external to the situation of lean production. The first is COVID. COVID created a tremendous disruption in supply chains and connects up to what you said about shipping containers being reduced, or ships being reduced. And of course, that was kind of a criticism, initial criticism of lean production, saying that lean production had a tremendous vulnerability to supply chain disruptions, which COVID created. However, at this point in time, the shipping at Long Beach and other California ports, the blockages have kind of reversed themselves. And as a result, prices for containers reaching the United States have gone down considerably. And they're going to go down more because Maersk is bringing in the biggest shipping company in the world, is bringing in something like 5 or 6 new ships that are, have tremendous capacity. So they're going to be decommissioning ships and so on. So consequently, the supply chain blockages have decreased. The second of 3 things is that we have this new kind of Cold War with China. And as a result of this Cold War, the United States is, and quite surprising to me, is effectively blocking new technologies for semiconductor production, blocking that those facilities, especially the company in the Netherlands, from distributing their chip making machines to China.
They are the first ones.
And so,
The Dutch companies are the first ones on the market. I know, yes.
And so the United States has convinced them not to give much of that technology to China. And of course, China's had this, new COVID waves and all sorts of disruptions. As a result, you have legislation passed in the United States to promote chip production in the United States. And TSMC, the biggest producer of chips, now is constructing a plant in Arizona, having some problems, but also getting a lot of big backing. And eventually, I think people in Taiwan are thinking that they're going to have to transfer a lot of production from Taiwan to other locations. So also connected to this, you have the issue of rare earths, which fit into a lot of phone technology and so on. And China's been the leading producer of rare earth. And because it's kind of open surface, it's very, so consequently, these complicate the situation. The third thing is tech. Major disruptions, not just in lean production, but it's doing 2 things. First of all, battery plants are going up all over the place in the United States. All sorts of incentives to create these battery plants. And the battery plants are employing like 1,000 to 3,000 workers. So this is a major increase in employment in the United States. And recently, some of them have voted to join the UAW, especially the plant in Warren, Ohio, where the previous big GM plant existed. So consequently, you're getting these kinds of changes. Meanwhile, the automobile companies in the United States are laying off everybody connected to internal combustion engines. And this is not so much workers, it's more engineers and even vice presidents. A year ago, Ford let their vice president of engine production let him go and didn't replace them, which was like, I saw that as, this is a big change. As a result, now engineers are being laid off in droves from Ford and GM, engineers who are connected to gasoline production. So consequently, the automobile companies are they've been hit by these 3 changes that are a mixture of good things like expanding markets for electric cars, and bad things in terms of getting rid of a lot of employees, closing engine plants, and so on. So it's difficult to assess exactly what's happening with lean production, because these 3 factors are really a very confusing mix of, for instance, COVID. COVID created massive disruptions. Electric cars are creating, massive disruptions. And the changes in the Chinese market are producing a new industrial policy in the United States where the government is pouring money into chips, pouring money into battery production, pouring money into solar panels, which the Chinese market has emphasized tremendously. So consequently, these three factors that create a tremendously complicated situation to say what's happening with lean production at this point. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Thomas. Very stimulating intervention. I will answer first of all by saying that when I'm saying that lean production is hitting the wall, it will hit the wall, I say that as a hegemonic managerial model. I don't say that it will disappear, not as much as Taylorism didn't disappear, and as much as global Fordism didn't disappear. Fordism became global and it didn't disappear. So I'm just saying that as a model, as an organizational model that is now applied in hospitals, in schools, universities, and in car manufacturing companies, it will face a crisis of vitality, efficiency, and let's say efficiency. So that was the first point. Second, about COVID, I agree that it is like we can see it as an external event, but as said that German philosopher Friedrich Hegel, necessity always happen by accident. So I mean, like a pandemic like COVID, it was an accident waiting to happen. You just read Rob Wallace, just read some biological history of the last 20 years from Ebola or the first flus of early years 2000, just integrate the ecological crisis as it developed itself at a fast rate, and you can understand that COVID and the pandemic, it was in a certain way, it could have happened somewhere else, but it was an accident waiting to happen. Of course, it has had a lot of disruptive effects on the global value chains, and especially the fact that China is applying a policy of zero COVID, so closing every factory. So there is nothing coming up. Then it starts again, then it stops again, then it starts again. And above all, at the other side of the market, you have governments pouring money into the market so that consumers can buy again what they were expecting to buy since 2 years. So you have the two elements of zero COVID on one side and helicopter money on the other side. Of course, that is also an element of the lack of balance or the disruption of value chains. So at that point, I agree with you. The last point is the point of the new Cold War. I think that in the United States, they understood that emerging countries from the South, the global South, Brazil, India, South Africa, China as supplier could become a threat, that the alliance between Russia and China was also a second threat. And so they said we are too much dependent on Taiwan, Foxconn, the semiconductors produced far away. We have to friendshore, we have to bring back production in our countries, which, and that's my last point, which doesn't mean that it will be an easy game, because in Arizona you can put a factory and you can have the solar energy, but you don't have necessarily the water to make that factory work. So the Marienburg is a place where they want to set up a factor of semiconductors almost as large as in Taiwan. And they know two things: it consumes as much electricity as a city like Leipzig or Dresden, first. Second, it consumes as much water, but much more cleaner water than the water than we are drinking. So it needs also energy to produce that clean water, without which you don't have semiconductors, you don't have microchips. So it won't be an easy game. It will take 4, 5, 6 years, and China is catching up. So they will be able to produce their own microchips in 4 or 5 years. And they have a domestic market. They have also a financial crisis coming up. But so I think we have entered a period of turbulence of crisis, which doesn't mean that lean production will cease to exist, but it won't be the answer, the new one best way, as we have knew it the last 20 years.
Yes, so sorry, there is echo. Because Lorenzo, you have the microphone open. So Lorenzo has a question. I have also Martin Schroeder has a question. So
You are some mute because I can open mine.
okay.
Hello? Oh. Now? Can you hear me?
I mute you. So.
Okay, so you colleague is online. I hope you can hear us. I'm in the same room with Tommaso. So Stefan, I have two comments. I could partly or broadly to some extent agree with your conclusions, but I'm not entirely sure of some of the arguments you raise or some of the examples you give to reach these conclusions. And I will point at two elements that you partly already touched in your last response. I'm not even sure, probably is also a matter of focus. Some questions, some of these issues could be demonstrated if you did not only focus on the European industry, but you embrace the more global view. And it's, I mean, those who know, those of you who know me know that I tend to point there in that direction most of the times. But so the first point is in terms of this decline or this crisis in labor relations that you mentioned, and in relation to the overarching idea of a leaning crisis. I mean, if you look at the European cases, to what extent this is part of a crisis, to what extent is a victory of what had to be achieved, if you look at the European cases. Different is when you look at extra-European cases. I refer, for example, at some of the things I wrote when I analyzed the lean in India, and or at the big strikes that have happened in Asia in general. In that case, that is a fact that could justify the idea that lean is in crisis, that lean has hit the wall, but not necessarily the examples you draw on if you think at the labor crisis, as you mentioned. But maybe you can respond to me or expand on this, how we put this in context, and if this can't be seen also from the other side of the coin, i.e. a victory. On the other hand, I would reconnect to this question that you mentioned, that Thomas also discussed, this idea of disorganization of global value chains. I mean, in a sense, the expansion of global value chains was exactly the outcome of this integration of outsourcing required by making production leaner. And in single nodes of the chains, you can see that lean is still dominant. So my point here would be, as you started like discussing and touching upon, we could say this is a crisis or it's just a disruption. We could consider that the alternative might be reshoring, but we have already discussed that this reshoring, it's very costly, and is, in my point of view, it's very unlikely to happen because there are too many advantages of being located, at least in terms of component production, in the southern countries. And this also ignores a large part of trade relations in terms of components that, for example, happens south. So how do we consider this as a real crisis or as a temporary deviation, but where the model is still like successful and running? Sorry for the length. I'll mute again.
Okay, Stefan, I propose to collect a few questions. So because I see that Martin has already been waiting. So
yeah, absolutely. I have a pencil and I write down, and so we can move on faster.
Very good. Martin, please.
Hi, good evening from Japan. Let's say, I think it's more of a comment than a question, but I'm sharing the, let's say, skepticism that mixing everything together and attributing it to lean is a good approach, because it's mixing too many things together, I think. And the other reason I think it's problematic is lean in general is maybe now a label for everything. And I think that especially when we think about just one example from the supply chain, I think it's like the meaninglessness of lean as a label maybe makes more sense. So I just want to give you one example. Regarding the semiconductor crisis, we had similar disruption here in Japan in 2011 after the earthquake and tsunami, right? And then lots of Japanese colleagues conducted studies, including Taka Fujimoto, who many people from JAPISA know very well. And they basically found that this restarting of the value chain for semiconductors takes at least half a year. And everybody can read those papers, like they came out in 2013, 14, 15. So everybody has this information, okay? And the funny thing for me is that the only company that I know in Japan that took this lesson to heart was Toyota. So Toyota, I think 2017 or 18, required their supply chain to have half a year of inventory for semiconductors. You can find news articles about this, right? And so that means the inventor of lean is adapting the basic philosophy of the right part in the right amount and the right time, right? In understanding that not each part has to be the same amount and the same time, right? It depends on the specific part, and you should study your supply chain. And I think your point is actually good, because it shows you that there's this, let's say, Toyota system, which is actively learning and improving. And there's maybe this lean business school version, if you want to, that is trying to give everybody like a ready-made answer of what to do. You just have a formula and you execute the formula. Okay, and I think that I agree that this formula approach is wrong because it's hitting those walls. But if you look at what Toyota is doing and not being narrow-minded, but actually studying the actual problems and going to the Gemba and finding solutions, is maybe more sustainable than the lean approach, which is ironic. Right? That's just my comment on that subject, if you want to, because I think that I have to teach lean production, and I usually prefer to teach Toyota because it's one clear system that is interconnected. And when you go to lean, you have everything and anything connected to it, and it's like a wild mix for me. So I don't know if that's a helpful or useless comment to you, but I think that maybe if you do your further analysis or do follow-up research, it would be helpful to specify what you mean by lean, and maybe also try to see if there are differences between different companies that you observe, right? Because it's maybe giving you like a more complicated but interesting picture than just saying lean is going to fail. So sorry for the lengthy points.
Stefan, I have further comments, but perhaps you want to answer first to those.
Well, I can answer to that one if there are. So Lorenza and Martin, but I see that there is a colleague also, Giorgio, who is asking the floor. It's
well, you can answer it first, Stefan. It's okay. I can wait. You
okay.
want to answer it first? Go ahead.
Okay. Well, it will be quite short. I think that when I'm speaking about crisis of labor relations, I do understand that in a broader scope. So not only strike or unionization or disruptive wildcat strikes or exit high turnover, it's all that together. And I think that in certain countries where you have a huge reserve army of labor or high unemployment, it changed something. I mean, the labor relations won't be the same. So that gives an element of answer regarding the varieties of situation we can face in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, or in northern in Europe or United States. So, but it's an element that is recurring in the way that, as we can see in Europe, a lot of people will retire. There are a lot of labor shortages. They don't know how to find the drivers, and they don't know how to find the workers that are willing to work for that low wage. So they will need migration, but it's not a solution that will be, it won't be solved in 1 or 2 years. So that's the first point. The second point is the fact, and that's a real debate with Martin. I think that I have some good friends that are informaticians, developers, working for state departments or for big companies, for European Commission, and as informaticians dealing with algorithms, writing programs, organizing a whole network of connectiveness. They all work with the model of Agile and Scrum. And we know that Agile and Scrum is based upon Lean. And they all say the way we work with that is completely stupid. If you would go back to the philosophy of it, of reiteration, of reinterpretation, of making a balance and improving really, it would work much better. But they all say, as informaticians, and they don't work on the assembly line, they all say, we don't have the time. Managers don't give us the time to do it that way. So what is the root of the problem? I can say Lean is ill of itself as a model coming from Toyota productive system. I can say that as hypothesis, Lean is ill of itself, but I can also say that in fact, it's the competition, it's the intercapitalist competition, it's the strength of that imperative that is the source of the problem. And so the only answer is planification, doing less, and knowing that if you have a planification on several years, there are scarcity of resources. You have to think about the products in a different way, not as a product you can throw away 2 or 3 years after. That's my answer.
Joy, you can ask your question now.
Yes, Stefan, thank you. That was a very fascinating discussion. Yeah, I just want to have some clarification. I totally agree with you guys. I think one thing that I like to add is on the key, how would I say this? Speaking of Japanese Lean, would say is monozukuri, or the craftsmanship. I think that's important to understand that. And here in Japan, it's kind of annoying to non-Japanese when they talk about Lean, because Lean has become the global model, and this is what they really want to. So for example, in Japan, we have AOTS and anything like that. They acknowledge there is a, for example, Indian Lean, Indonesian Lean, Brazilian Lean. So they know that. So in our academic community, we tend to put one label, Lean. And Lean itself in Japan has changed, and they acknowledge that. And I think Stefan has already argued quite well on that aspect. So like where he puts it is in the intercapitalist competition, I think more and less. Like we can see from Toyota manufacturing in different countries, even in ASEAN, they even have competition. You know, what is Lean from different countries, from Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, and so forth. So I think the key message I'd like to share with you is that, you know, when we talk about Lean, has been studied so much in making things complicated, but it's important for us to clarify what type of Lean you're talking about. The Japanese Lean, the context, the manufacturing, you know, you cannot just put Lean for everything, because again, this is a part of the I think the further discussion. Thank you.
I would like to add some elements to this debate, because I agree with all of you, but disagree with some of you. So I think this is an important debate. So Toyota is a company that has been very successful. There is no doubt about that, but also enjoy very, very favorable conditions for most of the time, because yeah, the domestic competitor, there was Nissan. And we know that Nissan was in many ways much less efficient. Yes, this handicap of their own trade unions, which was not a real trade union, but was like a double management with internal struggle. And we know also that they had a much less efficient supply chain. The Keiretsu was corrupted. And so Nissan in the domestic market was not really competitor for Toyota. So Toyota has a very good control of the Toyota market. And then all the Japanese enjoyed a very strong competitive advantage in the 80s. Then in the 90s, as Thomas and Stefan highlighted, these competitive advantage faded. for different reasons, including the yen revaluation with the Plaza Agreement in 1985. And starting from then, Toyota had faced several crises in Japan in the 90s with the difficulty of recruiting young workers, and that was partly solved with the economic crisis in Japan, but also globally. I mean, there is a first part of lean triumph up to the 80s, and then Toyota had to struggle many times, had quality crisis in the early 2000s. He had in 2009, he had the recalls, he had the Asian crisis. Toyota was hit very much. So I think there is, and Toyota has been changing its production system. So I think it's also important to put in context lean and the factors that make it work. So also the globalization has helped tremendously car makers to reduce costs. So there's really a question, is that lean that was efficient, or is the fact of transferring a huge amount of production to Mexico or to Central Eastern European countries, or to important parts from China or Asia, and then still selling very expensive cars in US, Europe, the key to the profitability of car makers, or is the efficiency in organizing their supply chain and factories that has contributed to that? This is another question, because if we consider that car makers have enjoyed this amazing advantage of being able of producing more and more components and cars in low wages countries, enjoying the fact that supply chain and cost of transport has reduced dramatically. And so that has been key with the software technology to structure this global value chain. And so if lean is inside this and is part of all these things, so that's why I understand the criticism against the point of you're confusing lean with other things. But at the same time, when you judge the efficiency of lean, how can you separate the so-called efficiency of lean, of organizing the supply chain, of reducing cost, of optimizing the production flow, from all these contexts that has been crucial in the development of the automotive industry in the last 20 years. And certain degree, when I agree with Stefan, when we say it's eating the wall, is the fact that we see, for example, the question of the labor market, I think is a good point. It's not often brought together, but if you consider the number of strikes in India that has been multiplied by 10 in the 2010 and recently, with several factories, including the Toyota factory blocked for months. The Toyota factory in India has been locked down for 3 months recently. And that's also Maruti Suzuki. And there's been really important labor crisis in India. In China, we heard about the labor movement in Southeast of the suppliers of Honda that has spread, and you had like 40, 60 strikes coming up together. In Europe, I think that there is this work done by our colleagues on Fiat. They had made an inquiry with the questionnaire. Over like 60% of the workforce replied. So we had the biggest inquiry ever made in a lean production environment. And like the large majority of the workers says that working condition efficiency have been going down in the last 10 years, and that is becoming almost unbearable. If you consider, I don't know, that Sebastian Carbonell is here with us, is done work on Stellantis factory in France. And you can see that the absenteeism is over 10% in all these factories, reaching 15, 16, 17% in some cases. And because the workforce is old and just they cannot, and they've been introducing more and more flexible working agreement. This is another part that I think is important about eating the wall. Toyota was associated with permanent employment, the lifetime employment of Japan. Now, if you look at lean production globally, it's 60, 70% of workers that have no permanent contract. Agency workers represent nowadays the majority of workers all around the world. In some cases, they're 25% of the workforce. In some cases, they're 70% of the workforce. When the industry can, they would like to have 100% agency workers. I've heard that recently about Chinese factories of Volkswagen. They're looking at flexibilizing the whole workforce. And this is also contributing once again in keeping lean going. That's why it does. You had first the relocation of production to low-cost countries, and then these flexibilization of the workforce that allow to produce more on demand, not really on demand, but to adjust production to market flow in a way that was not possible before by having this huge amount of agency workers. But this is why the workforce do not want to work anymore in these factories. So I think it's a mixture of things. On one hand, lean is at the core of the industry. It is a system that is very rigid and fragile, so it requires a lot of organizations surrounding it to reduce costs. So you have just the minimum required to do what you're supposed to do, and that is very challenging. And then it's surrounded by the supply chain, these temporary workers, these low-cost countries that have contributed to keep the products running. And this machine is eating the wall. I agree with Stefan, because you cannot push any further on workforce. All the people I talk that manage factories, they say, well, we have cut so deep in reducing costs, in pushing flexibility, that it's not possible to push any further. We are reaching the limit of what we can achieve in terms of cost reduction, in terms of leanness. But the industry is also surrounded by these tools that have helped them to keep the lean engine at the core running, is now facing more and more difficulties in making the margins also that the finance required. This is another aspect, that you have more financialization that has taken control of these companies. So if before the auto business is, I make cars, I make profits enough to grow, now it doesn't work anymore like that. It means you need to make cars, and you need to be dimensioned in a way in which you make 7-8% margins. That's for 10% margins, and that's how it works. So you have a lot of pressure, and I believe that eventually the core will be it. The core will stop running, and we see more and more quality problems, more factories having too much turnover, having too much health and safety problems. There is this kind of crisis, I think, that is going on. So I agree and disagree, but I think that we need to have in mind that you have a lean core to the industry, and then all the things that surround it have helped this core running up to this time, have made things possible, have increased flexibility where it was not flexibility by making all the workers more and more precarious. But these start to reach a limit, I believe. I think also Thomas wrote about the temps workers that are so important for the South, workers, for the workers in the South in the United States. And he stressed out these people do not have a life. And that's not, so there are several inputs from all around the world and for people here in this virtual room that point to the fact that we are reaching limits. And so the question, and with these challenges piling up, eventually I think the core will melt down. That there is a risk that might happen. It's not a certainty, but I agree with Stefan that lean might be going to a wall. And we know that when it will hit the wall. Up to that time, it will keep running, but there will be a moment in which we will see more and more problems arising from inside the machine.
If I can make a second comment. I just want to take off on a point that Martin Schroeder made, which was that when Toyota faced the crisis in 2017 and 2018 in Japan due to the earthquake, that they then required their suppliers to increase their inventories and so on, which is basically a violation of just-in-time production. But it got me thinking, first of all, assumes a relatively stable environment. So consequently, when you get an unstable environment, just-in-time inventory has problems. And I think it kind of goes in 3 stages. First of all, lean production operates relatively well, and I'm generalizing a bit here, with stability. Lean production then operates relatively well when you have moderate changes where teams crisis situations, then you have large instability in the environment. And then I think what, and you could say this is the point where lean production hits the wall, But what I'd like to point to is Osono, Shimizu, and Takeuchi's book, Extreme Toyota, which talks about the radical contradictions of Toyota, and that oftentimes Toyota reverses itself in terms of its lean production principles, which is what Martin Schroeder referred to in terms of requiring suppliers to have large inventories and so on. So when you reach the crisis stage, then you do whatever works to survive and so on. So in what we're observing, I think, is more of lean production facing a crisis stage, and rather than lean production hitting the wall. And when any company reaches a crisis stage, where do they go to? What model do they go to? Well, largely they go to whatever works. And as Sono, Shimizu, and Takeuchi show, Toyota, when it reaches those big problems, will go for solutions that aren't exactly kosher lean production. So let me just suggest that perhaps that three-stage model. One problem with saying Toyota or lean production is hitting the wall. When you hit the wall, what is the alternative model? So I think you have to kind of answer that question also, and also what other companies do when they're facing the crisis. What is their alternative model? What is their go-to kind of approach? Okay, I'll stop there.
Stefan, do you want to reply, add some comments?
Yes, I will do it in short sentences. First of all, I think that one of the aspects we didn't took the time to discuss sufficiently up till now is the fact that the profit rate, the rate of profit, is it's going down. For Amazon in the UK, they had a net profit of 250 pounds. Royal Mail, which is the former public service, they had a net profit of 600 million millions. Both of their profit rate is around 4 or 5%. If we go to the industry, let's say the average profit rate in the industry, it's not like in the services, you have 8 up to 10, sometimes 11, depends. When the profit rate is too low, those that are investing will invest somewhere else, somewhere where profit rate is higher. Pharmaceuticals, energy providers, whatever. So if the car manufacturing sector that had quite high profit rates is facing a crisis of profitability and a crisis of sustainability and of market, I mean by that being able to sell enough to make profit, given the height of the costs, we can see two things. We will see mergers, which we are seeing. You have Stellantis, but Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi, it's one global alliance, and Renault is controlling Nissan and Nissan is controlling Mitsubishi. So we can have that. Like merging, so capital will find an answer which is not an organizational answer, but an economic answer to the problem of profitability. The second point is the fact that even if they are merging and we will have more oligopolies and more concentration of capital at the global level, there is a problem of sustainability. And that problem can only be solved by creating more costs. Solving the problem of sustainability, electricity, microchips, providing water, providing energy, and so on. And all these problems, they can only be solved by having more costs, by facing more costs. So I think the problem is not only an organizational problem, it's also an economic problem. And I'm not sure it is a crisis that will take 5 or 10 years, but I'm sure that as much as other levels, this will not be an easy going.
I would like to stress one point that is interesting, is that right now, in the middle of this crisis with the COVID and the semiconductor supply chain disruption, actually the automotive industry is doing quite well. I mean, if you look at the profits rates in Europe, at least Stellantis had like more than 10% profit margin. Renault, that was losing a lot of money, is back into profit, and the premium brands in Germany and Volkswagen are doing well. And the condition of this profitability are interesting, is the fact that there is no competition, because you have the supply chain, which is blocked. So the demand is more than the supply. And that creates a condition in which car makers are not competing anymore with each other, and they can sell the products at the price they more or less want. And they can also select the products they want to sell. So part of the problem of profitability can be solved by reducing competition, which is something that we always know in economic sociology, which is that all the organization of capitalism is about reducing competition rather than relying on competition. And this is a situation that is going to disappear. I mean, it's not going to last. And so that the scope of the crisis we're going through is not visible yet. I mean, all this COVID disruption and all the impact of this supply chain crisis has been creating an environment which is very difficult to understand, because states have been subsidizing, at least in Europe, they've been heavily subsidizing the employment. So these companies did not have to make redundancies. Also, the supply chain has been subsidized, so companies did not have to fail and further disrupting the industry. And this has been happening in Europe for like 3 years. And you can see that in the debts of the state, in the deficit that is going off the roof. But with inflation now, but eventually you knew that it was going to end. But with inflation, it is going to end very fast, because the interest rates are going up and states cannot sustain anymore this strongly debt-oriented approach to the COVID crisis and then to the supply chain crisis for the automotive industry. So I guess that one important point here is that the crisis of the COVID and the crisis of the electrification also, that is another crisis, because you need to sell these cars that cost 10, 15,000 euros more than those that replace. And you need to make some sacrifice. Either you cut down the cost dramatically, or you reduce your production, or you reduce your margins or your profits. I mean, either way, you need to deal with that. And all these for the time being has not happened yet, because also the states have been subsidizing the sales of all these electric cars, and not up to 10,000 euros per car in France right now. But of course, the capacity of the state of subsidizing the takeoff of the electric market will finish as well. So we are going to see, I think, in 2-3 years' times, the real crisis. The real crisis is not here yet. It will materialize in 2-3 years' times. And then we will see how the lean system will react to that, how will absorb that. I think the CEO of Stellantis was very explicit about that, is Tavares, and he said that, well, before we need to reduce, to increase productivity by 5% per year to be capable of delivering the profitability that is required and making the investments on. Now we'll have to do 3 times more in order to digest electrification. And that was before the inflationary pressures and before the Ukrainian war. And the solution of Stellantis is very simple. Is really about I become smaller and smaller. I mean, I make less and less. I buy more and more, and I use synergies. I use all these different merge to drastically reduce what I keep inside the perimeter of my company. My company has to become lighter and lighter. And because of that, I will be more resilient to the crisis that will come than competitors. And perhaps I will buy more of them in the future. That's clearly what Tavares has been saying in the last couple of years in terms of his strategy, is I will be more competitive when the bad times will arrive, because I will be leaner, but leaner to a point that really is almost like a fabless company. Not that Stellantis will stop producing cars, but it will try to make less and less and rely more and more on resources that can be cut when the crisis arrives. So again, workforce, stable workers will represent 1/4 of what you need when the cycle is hot, and 75% will be agency workers, for instance. And buying more things. Also, electrification is that. You give up, powertrain is gone, and then you will rely on battery makers that will be separate companies from you, and they will have to deal with their own. The powertrain inside the company might be things from the past. You control technologies, but you try to produce less and less. And if this is the future of lean, I think this is going farther down the same direction. Eventually, all of these will end up in some sort of crisis, because it's keeping doing what you were doing before, but more and more and more, amplifying the consequences of vulnerability, fragility. I don't see any signs of making the supply chain more resilient, or you cannot do, I mean, if the solution is, okay, I decide which part of the supply chain I retain 5 months, as Thomas has said, how do you figure out? I mean, what is coming next? And more of that, we go down that line. If companies follow that line, more it will become difficult for the supplier chains to be resilient. So I think the crisis is not there yet. It will materialize when this very murky situation in which we are right now will clarify, and then we will see what happens.
I completely agree with Tommaso. But there is one point that is not clear enough. That is who will buy the cars if the middle class is disappearing, if the state is not subsidizing, buying the cars that will be costing 20% more than it was before. You can make the cars cheaper if you exploit the workers more, but those workers, they won't buy the cars like in the 20s and the 30s. Those that were working at Peugeot, Talbot, and Renault, they were not able to buy the cars. It's only in the 60s that the workers of Volkswagen could buy the cheapest car of Volkswagen. So if you go down that line, the question remains where's the market? Where will you sell the cars that will cost all that much? And if you make them cheaper, who will be able, or who will be able or willing to work for that cheap labor? Like a sweat job. And then you have the problem of the social deal, or the compromise, or the agreement you need for a willing workforce, willing and intelligent and disposable and so on. So I agree with you, the real crisis will only arrive in a couple of years.
Hello, Mike. So you join us. Do you have any comments on our discussion?
Just rather than these big picture items, I mean, whether the middle class is declining or not, affordability, some of these may be short-run issues tied to the challenges of increasing battery supply short-run. Whether EVs will dominate, that's a separate issue. A lot of things there. But let me look at lean and do it from a sort of supplier bottom-up perspective. And lean is really an attempt to bring to automotive a continuous production, a flow production approach. That works very well for certain items. Maybe the quintessential lean would be seat production, where seat factories are located within an hour or sometimes up to 2 hours drive from the customer assembly plant. And the one that I know that was supplying Honda would get orders the day before matching the assembly sequence. And so there was only maybe 2 trucks worth of inventory in the system, and a bad accident could end up closing down the production line if the trucks can't get through. So parts are loaded onto, assembled with a color and fabric and options, put on the truck in the assembly sequence so that when they're taken off the truck, they just flow onto the line. Something that is the opposite end is steel, which has always been a batch process. Now, automotive steel is very specific to particular customers. So stamping lines are calibrated around very specific grades of steel, and a steel that is shipped to one customer may be different from that shipped to another. Even if they are the same steels, the steel producers are very careful not to tell customers that to be able to charge a better price. But that means the car companies all along have had to maintain large inventories of steel, more so when specialty steels were made in only a couple mills globally and had to be shipped across oceans. So some of what we're seeing in the supply chain is that semiconductors are fundamentally a batch process. Certain chips that are used in automotive are 6 months from start to finish just in the semiconductor fab. And so if you don't order in advance, or if you lose your place in the queue, it's very hard to catch up. So car companies, as the sheer numbers of chips were increased, they were ordering inventories in advance, but they obviously misjudged the magnitude of the interruptions to their or the demand that the fabs faced from other customers. And then when they canceled orders during the depths of the pandemic in early 2020, that it would be very hard to ever work their way out of that shortfall. So I think some of what we're seeing is that, lean is well and good, but lean applies best to things that can be produced in close proximity and in something approaching a flow process. The things that rely upon a batch are not easy to fit into the big picture, simple definition lean. So that's part of what I see happening, is that the auto companies are much more dependent on core batch processes, and they haven't really adjusted their practices, or they didn't do it in time in early 2020, and they're still trying to catch up now almost 3 years later.
Thank you, Mike. Good points. I think there are 2 debates going on. One is how much the situation we are dealing with is just a matter of something exceptional that will fade away, or something more structural that is eating the industry. And so that's always the story. I mean, is how much is a matter of context, how much is something building up, leading to a more structural crisis. I mean, if we go back few years before the Fordist crisis, I think nobody has seen that crisis coming in such a big way, but there were a lot of signals that things were not going well. But then suddenly, a combination of factors, the oil shocks, the Japanese competitions, the fact that we're ready for certain products, some regulations kicking up on more environmental friendly cars, and then suddenly the old things just blow up. So are we in a similar situations now or not? What's different? I think it would be interesting to compare, because there are many things that now with inflation, I think we have a big flavor of the 1970s coming back. And it would be interesting to go back and see what were the views, how things were analyzed before the Fordist crisis. Not after, but before. I mean, it's how many people have seen this coming, and how do they explain? I remember that there's this famous Abernathy analysis of the Fordist crisis that basically was saying that Fordist was not capable of producing the variety and the quality required by the markets. And I don't believe that was completely right. Also because, in my opinion, it overestimated completely the capacity of what later became lean production, was called lean production, to solve these problems. And I think this is still part of the problems, is the fact that that is a matter of debate. We're reaching the end of our session, but I put that on the table. Is that lean has always been described as a flexible manufacturing system, and I always disagree on that, in the sense that one of the big principle of Toyota is to reduce a junka. I mean, to be sure that you synchronize everything, but also that you keep variety under control, that you standardize a maximum of things, that you have a product that is easy to manufacture. And when we, in Japisa, we made this work with, it was Yannick Lang, and then was Bruno Getin, who did this work on the variety of production of car makers. They found out that actually Toyota was the car maker who made least variety amongst all the car makers in the world. Was not pioneer in a lot of variety of production, but actually was very good in reducing variety and being capable of having a product that appealed to the market while not being in a lot of variety. And that helped their lean factories to produce and deliver according to the plan. And one big question is the complexity and variety of products is increasing for different reasons, but with electrification that might be also more the case. And is this a problem for lean? Is the fact of having to managing not only a lot of variety, but a lot of also instability in the markets, so that a junka becomes a real problem. You cannot level up production anymore. And we talk about the solutions. Solutions are 100% agency workers. But if you have 100% agency workers, you have the problems of having, where is the famous core workers who keep the lean production going, or make suggestions, or fix things in real times, who rotate inside the team to make the works. And I think these are fundamental contradictions, that you need more flexibility in a system that is rigid. How do you do that? How do you manage this flexibility with, if you don't have your team of experienced workers who rotate, who know how to fix things in real time, so the line doesn't break up? You cannot manage lean. Lean in the shop floor is about those type of workers. But if you have 100% agency workers, you cannot do that. But if you don't have agency workers, how do you manage a production that needs to shift from +20, -20%, 40, 50? And that is the nightmare of any lean production environment. You want your flow to be stable. You want to planify everything. And Toyota prefers to not even when they can sell more cars, they avoid to do that in order to keep these regulate production. They increase production just slowly and regularly. So I think this is another problem, is that lean is a planified, rigid, low variety and high standardization production environment. And despite everything has been said about flexibility and whatever, it's always been capable of managing that by finding new solutions. But once again, I'm wondering whether this new environment is putting too much pressure on this, on the core lean that needs this planification, stability, stable workforce and experienced workforce. How do you keep that running in this environment? This to me is a fundamental question. to Tyre, or anybody has something to say about that?
I'm just wondering, and it got me thinking, Tommaso, along with other discussion, to what extent lean susceptible with the sustainability? I think their argument also, like Stephen brought it up, is on the labor practices, like also Tommaso just mentioned, right? You have to maintain certain key workers, but also some agency workers. So those type of practices, I think the school in Manchester, Business School Alliance, MBS, is already also strongly debated about that. So I'm not sure if, to what extent, my question would be, to what extent lean production can be associated with sustainability or otherwise.
Stefan, do you want to have some perhaps final words if there are no other questions in the rooms? I think we're definitely going back to this topic of lean in other sessions and the colloquium in June. So we also use this session to put together some more literature on the JERPISA site on that, perhaps. So I think it's time to bring back a special sessions with all the production, recent and old on lean. So we have a dedicated space for the lean production debate. So if you want to have some final words.
Well, I think you made a very good summary. You resumed very well the research program that is ahead of us. And so that we should take the time to write down some working papers and to have a second session, I don't know, the end of March, to clarify, to highlight the points of agreement and disagreement, or the analytical points that are coming up. And I think you did that very well, Tommaso.
Thank you. If there are not any other questions or comments, I think it can be time to finish our last seminar of the year. It's been a very rich year for JERPISA, but there are more to come next year. I just remind all of you that our call for papers will be out soon for the next colloquium. We're running a little bit late on that, but will come up. And so you will receive soon a mail with the call and with more detail about our forthcoming conference in Brussels at the end of June. And so I take advantage also to say to all of you that my best wishes for a Happy New Year, Christmas holidays, and all of the rest of that.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
Ciao, Rachele.
Ciao.
Ciao, Stefan.
Everyone have a good holiday.
Thank you, Mike. Bye, Thomas. Bye, Mark.
Joined late due to a daycare run.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, goodbye. Bye, Mark.